The HOA board started collapsing the moment residents saw the records. The deputy's lights hit the lake before sunrise, and the HOA president was already pointing at me like I was trespassing on my own land. Problem was, I wasn't standing on HOA property. I was standing on a lake I had legally purchased 3 weeks earlier, and sitting inside my truck was one county-stamped document. Nobody in that neighborhood had bothered to check before calling the cops. By the next morning, the same gate they used to control 200 families had become legally useless. And the deeper I dug into that HOA, the uglier the truth got. If you enjoy stories about land rights, quiet justice, and people standing their ground without losing their dignity, stick around and subscribe. These roads always lead somewhere interesting. The deputy's hand was already resting near his belt before he even reached the shoreline. "Sir," he called out, boots grinding against frozen gravel. "Step away from the dock for me." I looked up from the measuring tape stretched across the warped planks beneath my feet. The south support beam had more rot than I expected. Another hard winter, and half the dock would collapse into Old Bear Lake. Steam curled from the coffee sitting on my truck hood 20 yards behind me. I'd been on my property exactly 43 minutes. The sheriff's cruiser sat crooked beside the gate trail, red and blue lights still pulsing against the pine trees. Behind it, a white Range Rover rolled to a stop, spraying dust across the frozen grass. The driver door swung open hard. Vanessa Holloway stepped out already angry. She wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my first pickup truck and carried a leather binder tucked against her hip like a weapon. 2 residents followed behind her from the SUV, both watching me the way people watch someone they've already decided is guilty. "There," Vanessa snapped, pointing directly at me. "That's him." Not gesturing, pointing, like I'd vandalized something. Deputy Cole Bennett slowed slightly, eyes moving from her to me and back again. Vanessa closed the distance fast, heels crunching over the gravel path leading toward the dock. "He changed the gate lock," she said sharply. "He posted private property signs and blocked access to a community lake used by this neighborhood for over 20 years. The deputy looked at me. "You Ethan Mercer? Yeah, you own this parcel?" "I do." Vanessa laughed once under her breath. "He purchased a parcel," she corrected. "That doesn't suddenly give him the right to remove access from 200 families." The lake behind me stayed perfectly still, dark water reflecting the gray Montana sky. A thin wind rolled across the shoreline, carrying the smell of wet cedar and cold mud from the dock posts. I reeled in the tape measure slowly. Vanessa pointed toward the metal sign bolted beside the gate trail. "Community Lake Access, Silver Ridge Estates HOA, established 2002. "That sign has been there for over 2 decades, she said. "This lake belongs to the community." I stepped off the dock onto the shoreline gravel. "No," I said calmly. "It doesn't." The 2 residents exchanged looks behind her. Deputy Bennett cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a complaint about unlawful restriction of community property access. Did you run the parcel number before driving out here?" That caught him off guard. Vanessa answered before he could. "We already explained the situation to dispatch. The HOA maintains this property. We have records going back years." "Maintenance records aren't ownership records," I said. Her expression tightened immediately. The deputy looked uncomfortable now, caught between somebody yelling loudly and somebody speaking quietly. I walked toward my truck slowly enough not to spook anyone. Vanessa stiffened the second I opened the passenger door. Inside sat a thick county-stamped folder, deed papers, tax records, title commitment. Every page carrying my name. I rested one hand on top of it. "You should probably have your attorney pull the county recorder's index before this goes any further," I said. Vanessa folded her arms. "I don't care what paperwork you brought with you." That was the first real mistake she made. Deputy Bennett glanced toward the folder. "What exactly did you file?" I looked at him, not her. Something that matters a hell of a lot more than that sign. The wind rattled the loose chain on the locked gate beside the trail. More residents had started gathering farther uphill, near the subdivision entrance, drawn by the flashing lights. Vanessa noticed them too. Good audience for her. This community built that dock, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Families raised their children here. You think buying one parcel gives you the right to erase 20 years. I kept my voice even. I think recorded ownership matters. You're trying to steal a community landmark. No, I said. I bought private property. The deputy finally pulled out his notepad. I'm going to need identification from both of you. Vanessa looked irritated that he'd included her in that sentence. I handed mine over immediately. While he walked back toward his cruiser, Vanessa lowered her voice. You really think a county filing scares me? I looked past her toward the HOA sign swaying slightly beside the gate. White lettering, blue border, cheap aluminum bolts already rusting around the edges. No, I said quietly. I think what's on that filing is going to scare your lawyer. For the first time since arriving, she hesitated. Just a flicker. Then it disappeared. Deputy Bennett returned a minute later holding my ID. The parcel does come back under Mr. Mercer's ownership, he admitted carefully. At this point, this appears to be a civil matter. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. You're kidding. I didn't say she's wrong, he replied cautiously. I said this isn't something I can enforce roadside without a court order. The residents near the trail started whispering among themselves. Vanessa noticed. Her jaw tightened hard enough to show beneath the cold morning light. This isn't over, she said to me. I closed the truck door gently. I know, I replied. Then I picked up my coffee, still warm. And while Vanessa Holloway stood beside that gate, convinced 20 years of HOA control made her untouchable, the one thing she hadn't bothered checking was already sitting inside the county recorder's office. Filed 3 weeks earlier. Stamped, indexed, permanent. That was the word that stayed in my head while I drove back through Silver Ridge Estates later that morning. The subdivision looked peaceful if you didn't know better. Pine-lined streets, fresh gravel driveways, boats covered for winter beside polished garages. Somebody had hung orange wreaths on the mailbox posts near the main entrance, and at the center of all of it sat Old Bear Lake. 4 acres of water every resident in Silver Ridge believed belonged to them. It never had. I parked beside the shoreline turnout just after noon and looked across the dock again. The same dock Vanessa Holloway had practically claimed as HOA property an hour earlier. The funny thing was, none of this had started because I wanted a fight. I'd spent 3 years looking for quiet land in western Montana, somewhere outside the noise. Somewhere people didn't knock on your door to discuss paint colors and mailbox violations. I found Old Bear Lake through a commercial land listing buried under expired ranch parcels and timber lots. Most buyers skipped past it because it looked useless on paper. No house, no utilities, just water, shoreline, and an access road running through Silver Ridge Estates. But when my title examiner called me the first time, her voice had that careful tone professionals use when they know they've found trouble. You know the HOA thinks they own this lake, right? I remember leaning back in my chair at the kitchen table. Do they? No, she said immediately. Not legally. That conversation changed everything. Within 48 hours, I had every county document spread across my dining room table. Plat maps, tax records, parcel transfers dating back 23 years. The original developer of Silver Ridge Estates had built the subdivision in 2001. 200 homes, walking trails, community pavilion, but not the lake. Old Bear Lake sat on a completely separate parcel from the HOA common areas. Different tax ID, different legal description, different ownership history. The developer kept it personally, and that mattered. Because somewhere along the way, The HOA had stopped understanding the difference between permission and ownership. I still remember the first time I saw the letter. One page, dated March 2002. The developer granting Silver Ridge residents permission to use the lake recreationally, until such permission is revoked by the property owner. Revoked. That single word practically glowed off the paper. No recorded easement, no deed transfer, no legal access agreement filed with the county. Just neighborly permission written 22 years earlier by a man who assumed people would behave reasonably forever. Big mistake. The developer died years ago. His estate transferred the parcel to a holding company that barely remembered it existed. They paid taxes on it every year without visiting once. Then I made an offer. The holding company accepted within 4 days. No negotiation, no resistance. Because legally there was nothing complicated about the sale at all. The complication came from the people living around it. 3 days before closing, I drove through Silver Ridge for the first time. I parked beside the lake trail and watched families fishing from the dock. Kids throwing rocks into the water. An older man cleaning a canoe. Everybody acting like they belonged there. I almost walked away from the deal right then. Not because I doubted the legality, because I understood what happens when people mistake routine for ownership. Then I saw the sign. Community Lake Access, Silver Ridge Estates, HOA property, that changed my mind. Because the second I saw HOA property bolted to county land they didn't own, I knew exactly what kind of people I was dealing with. People who stopped checking facts years ago. The morning after closing, before I even changed the gate lock, I drove straight to the county recorder's office. Miles Avery handled the filing personally. Mid-50s, wireframe glasses, slow voice. The kind of county clerk who remembered parcel numbers better than birthdays. He reviewed the document twice before stamping it. "You expecting problems?" he asked. "Probably." He nodded once like he'd seen this story before. "You're filing this at the right time then." The stamp came down hard against the paper. Recorded, indexed, permanent. I left the courthouse with certified copies in a manila folder and drove directly to Old Bear Lake. Vanessa Holloway was already there. She stood near the dock talking to 2 landscaping contractors while holding a clipboard against her chest. The HOA sign stood beside her like a campaign banner. She noticed my truck immediately. "You must be the buyer," she said. "Not welcome, not hello, buyer." I stepped out, holding the folder under one arm. Ethan Mercer, Vanessa Holloway, president of Silver Ridge Estates. The way she said president sounded almost official enough to belong on government stationery. She gestured toward the lake. "We'll need to coordinate access expectations moving forward." I remember that wording exactly. Expectations. Like I'd purchased a storage shed instead of 4 acres of private waterfront. "I already have expectations," I told her. That smile she gave me right then never reached her eyes. "Well," she replied lightly, "this community has used this lake continuously for over 20 years. I looked past her toward the sign. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I noticed." Then I walked down to the dock for the first time as owner of Old Bear Lake while Vanessa Holloway watched me from the shoreline, already planning a fight she didn't understand she had already lost. Because the document sitting inside my truck had changed everything before she ever called the deputy. And she still hadn't checked the county index. Vanessa made her first move 48 hours later. The violation notice arrived folded inside a white envelope stamped with the Silver Ridge Estates HOA crest. I found it wedged into the slot beside my gate chain when I drove back from town. Notice of community violation. The language underneath was almost impressive in how confidently wrong it sounded. Unauthorized restriction of shared community asset. Interference with established neighborhood access. Immediate corrective action required. Fine schedule attached. $250 per day until community access was restored. I stood beside the gate reading it while cold wind pushed ripples across Old Bear Lake behind me. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because somebody on that HOA board had actually convinced themselves they could fine a man for locking his own property. I folded the notice once and tucked it into the manila folder inside my truck. Evidence, everything went into the folder now. 3 days later, another notice arrived, then another. By the end of the week, Vanessa Holloway had apparently decided harassment counted as legal strategy. I started seeing her everywhere, standing beside the subdivision mailbox cluster, talking to residents in low, serious tones, walking the lake trail with a clipboard, holding little sidewalk meetings beside parked golf carts while people nodded along like she was preparing for war. Every version of the story made me sound worse. According to one resident at the gas station, I was a California investor trying to privatize community land. According to another, I planned to bulldoze the dock and build luxury cabins around the shoreline. By Friday afternoon, somebody had taped flyers to the community bulletin board near the entrance. Save our lake. The word "our" was underlined twice in red marker. I drove past it slowly on my way back to the property. Half a dozen residents stood nearby drinking coffee and watching my truck roll by. Nobody waved. The thing about anger is people like Vanessa know how to organize it fast. Facts take longer. That evening I changed the lock on the lake gate. Nothing dramatic. Just a heavy steel padlock and a chain thick enough to discourage somebody feeling emotional after a homeowners meeting. Then I mounted a sign directly beneath the old HOA placard. Private property authorized access. Only, I barely finished tightening the bolts before headlights appeared behind me. Vanessa's Range Rover, of course. She climbed out before the engine even stopped running. "You cannot do that," she snapped immediately. I just did. "This lake serves over 200 homeowners. This parcel belongs to me. You are intentionally escalating this situation." I tightened the wrench one final turn and stepped down from the gatepost ladder. "No," I said calmly. "I'm documenting ownership." Her eyes flicked toward the new sign like it physically offended her. "You think hiding behind legal paperwork makes you right?" "No," I replied. "The deed makes me right." That landed harder than she expected. Vanessa recovered fast, though. She always did. "You know what I think?" she said quietly. "I think you enjoy this." I looked past her toward the subdivision lights, beginning to glow through the trees uphill. "I think you've spent a long time mistaking control for ownership." Her jaw tightened instantly. For a second, I thought she might actually say something honest. Instead, she pulled another envelope from her binder and shoved it toward me. "Formal hearing notice," she said. "Emergency HOA review session. 7 days. I didn't take it immediately. You're holding a hearing about property your HOA doesn't own. We'll let the attorneys decide that." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. She still hadn't checked the filing. I finally took the envelope. She stepped closer before returning to her SUV. "You should understand something, Mr. Mercer," she said. "This community has protected that lake for over 20 years. Families built traditions there. Children grew up there." The lake water knocked softly against the dock behind me. Vanessa lowered her voice. "And if you think people are just going to accept some outsider locking them out, you don't understand this neighborhood at all." Then she got back into the Range Rover and drove uphill toward Silver Ridge Estates. Dust rolled slowly across the gate after her taillights disappeared. I opened the hearing notice beneath the beam from my truck headlights. Emergency Compliance Session. Silver Ridge Community Center. Mandatory attendance requested. At the bottom sat Vanessa Holloway's signature beside the HOA seal. Confident. Official. Completely disconnected from reality. I looked down toward the lake again. The dock sat empty beneath the dark waterline shadows, half rotted but still standing, just like the HOA's claim. Somewhere inside Silver Ridge Estates, Vanessa Holloway, was preparing to put on a public show about ownership while the one document capable of destroying her entire argument sat permanently indexed at the county recorder's office waiting for somebody smart enough to pull it. So far nobody had. The knock came just after sunset 2 days before the HOA hearing. I was in the workshop behind the lake cabin, sorting through replacement dock hardware, when I heard tires crunch slowly across the gravel drive. Not fast like Vanessa. Careful. An old Ford pickup stopped near the gate. An older couple climbed out. The man wore a canvas ranch jacket faded nearly white at the shoulders. The woman held a covered pie dish in both hands, like she felt awkward arriving empty-handed. I recognized them immediately. I'd seen them walking the lake trail weeks earlier before I changed the lock. The man raised one hand politely. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yeah." He nodded toward the gate. "Mind if we come in?" I unlocked it without answering. The woman smiled nervously. "I'm Martha Keene. This is my husband Owen." "Appreciate you coming out," Owen added quietly. "Not everybody in Silver Ridge is looking to hang you from a tree." That got the first honest laugh out of me in days. I led them toward the workshop, where a propane heater clicked softly beside stacks of treated lumber and dock brackets. Martha set the pie dish carefully on the workbench between us. "Apple," she said. Didn't know what else to bring. Then Owen reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a laminated card. Dock Access Pass, Silver Ridge Estates, HOA expiration date printed across the bottom. I took it from him slowly. "Vanessa issue these." "Every spring," Martha answered. "Has for years." Owen pulled out another card, then another. Different years, different colors, like parking permits. "She assigned dock times too," Martha said carefully. "Families got scheduled access windows during the summer once the complaints started." "Complaints?" "Too many residents at once," Owen replied. "Fishing disputes. Kids staying late. Noise." I looked down at the cards again. The HOA logo sat stamped across everyone. "When people broke the rules," Martha continued, "the board issued fines." She reached into her purse this time. "Folded violation notices. Late dock usage. Unauthorized kayak storage. After hours shoreline access. All carrying Vanessa Holloway's signature." I felt something cold settle deeper in my chest. Not anger. Structure. This wasn't improvisation anymore. Vanessa hadn't simply assumed control of the lake. She'd built an entire enforcement system around property her HOA never legally owned. "How long?" I asked. Owen exhaled heavily. "At least 15 years. The heater popped softly behind us. Outside, wind pushed against the workshop walls, carrying the distant sound of water hitting the dock pilings. Then Martha said the sentence that changed the entire direction of the case. "There was somebody who questioned it once." I looked up immediately. "Who?" "Board treasurer years ago," she replied. "Man named Fletcher Dunn." Owen nodded slowly. "Around 2008, maybe." He asked during a meeting whether the HOA actually held legal title to the lake. "What happened?" The couple exchanged a look first. "Nothing," Owen said finally. "That's what bothered him." Martha stepped closer to the workbench. He requested a title review officially. Vanessa wasn't president yet, but the board shut the conversation down almost immediately. "Why?" "Because people didn't want uncertainty," she answered quietly. "They liked believing the lake belonged to them." "And Fletcher?" Owen gave a humorless smile. "Didn't stay on the board much longer. That sat in the room for a moment. Not corruption exactly. Worse, convenience." I walked over to the filing cabinet beside the workbench and pulled out the growing Mediali folder. Notices, parcel maps, recorder copies, tax assessments. Then I added the dock permits carefully on top. Martha watched me organize everything. "You really think you can beat them?" she asked softly. I looked toward the dark lake through the workshop window. "They already beat themselves," I replied. "They just haven't realized it yet." The next morning I drove straight to the county records office. Miles Avery looked up from behind the counter the second I walked in. "Trouble escalating?" Predictably, I handed him the HOA pass cards. His eyebrows lifted immediately. "Well," he muttered, "that's aggressive. I need old board records," I said. "Anything involving the lake parcel." Miles disappeared into the archive room for nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, he carried a dusty storage binder thick with HOA filings and meeting records. "Most people never ask for these," he said, setting it down heavily. "Honestly, most HOAs hope nobody ever does." I spent 3 hours at the records table, flipping through old meeting minutes while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Then I found it. October 2008. Treasurer Fletcher Dunn formally requesting legal verification of HOA ownership regarding Old Bear Lake before further fee collection or enforcement actions continued. Board response: matter tabled pending review. No review ever recorded afterward. No follow-up. No legal opinion. Nothing. I copied every page. As I slid the papers into my folder, Miles looked over the counter toward me. "You know what this means, right?" "Yeah. It means somebody on that board already knew they might not own the lake 16 years ago." I closed the folder carefully. Outside the courthouse windows, snow clouds were beginning to roll down across the mountains. Inside Silver Ridge Estates, Vanessa Holloway was still preparing for her emergency HOA hearing, convinced she was defending community property. Meanwhile, buried in county archives sat proof the HOA had questioned ownership years earlier and quietly buried the answer. And now I finally had that too. The emergency HOA meeting happened 3 nights later during the first hard rainstorm of October. Water hammered the roof of the Silver Ridge Community Center, while headlights filled the parking lot outside. By the time I walked in, every folding chair in the room was occupied, and residents were standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. At least 100 people, maybe more. The second I entered, conversations dipped low enough for me to hear my own boots against the tile floor. Vanessa Holloway stood near the projector screen at the front of the room wearing a dark blazer instead of her usual winter coat. She looked prepared, composed, like somebody running for office. Her attorney sat in the front row beside 2 HOA board members I recognized from earlier notices. Expensive suit, gray hair, leather briefcase resting beside his chair. He looked at me once without smiling. I took a seat near the back. The projector clicked on. Old photographs filled the screen immediately. Children swimming off the dock. Families grilling beside the shoreline. Kayaks pulled onto the gravel bank under summer sunlight. Every image carefully chosen. Every image meant to make ownership feel emotional instead of legal. Vanessa stepped forward, holding a wireless microphone. "For over 20 years," she began, "Old Bear Lake has been the heart of this community." Nods spread through the crowd instantly. Rain pounded harder overhead. She walked slowly across the front of the room while the next slide appeared. Fireworks reflected over the lake during some old 4th of July celebration. Our children learned to swim there. Families built traditions there. Neighbors came together there. Then her voice hardened. "And now somebody who purchased a parcel 3 weeks ago thinks he can erase all of that." Half the room turned to look at me. I stayed still, Vanessa noticed. "The Silver Ridge HOA," she continued, "has maintained that lake continuously for decades. We repaired the dock, cleared the shoreline, paid for safety improvements." Another slide appeared showing budget entries. Lake Maintenance Fund, year after year. The crowd murmured approval. Then the attorney stood. "My name is Richard Latham," he announced calmly. "Our office has reviewed the matter extensively." That was a lie. If they'd reviewed it extensively, somebody would have checked the county filings already. Latham adjusted his glasses. Under Montana property law, long-term uninterrupted community use may establish what is known as a prescriptive easement. There it was. Exactly the argument I expected. Silver Ridge residents have openly used Old Bear Lake for over 20 years without interruption, he continued. We believe the HOA possesses strong legal standing to restore permanent community access. Applause broke out immediately. Not everybody, but enough. Vanessa folded her arms beside the screen, looking almost relieved. The room needed certainty, and she was feeding it to them by the spoonful. Then she looked directly at me. Mr. Mercer has chosen confrontation instead of cooperation, she said evenly. Instead of respecting a community tradition, he locked families out behind chains and warning signs. More applause. Somebody muttered, "Damn right," near the side wall. I watched the room carefully. Most of these people weren't cruel. That was the important part. They were scared. Scared of losing something they thought belonged to them. And Vanessa understood exactly how to use that fear. She opened the floor for comments. Hands immediately went up. One resident complained about children missing fishing weekends. Another accused me of planning private development around the shoreline. A third demanded the county investigate my purchase entirely. Every version of the story became larger each time somebody repeated it aloud. Finally, Vanessa looked toward the back. "Mr. Mercer," she said calmly, "would you like to explain yourself?" The room turned again. I stood slowly. No microphone, no presentation, just the county folder tucked beneath my arm. Rain rattled against the windows beside me while I looked across the crowd. I purchased Old Bear Lake legally, I said. The deed is recorded. The tax parcel is recorded. Ownership history is recorded. A few people shifted uncomfortably. I kept going. I requested documentation proving HOA ownership. Nobody provided any. Vanessa crossed her arms tighter. Because community use already establishes standing. Latham interrupted confidently. I looked directly at him. You should pull the county parcel index before filing anything else. The room went quiet for half a second. Then somebody laughed. A few others joined in. Vanessa smiled thinly into the microphone. We've already consulted counsel, Mr. Mercer. That's not what I said. Latham's expression changed slightly at that. Tiny shift. Nothing dramatic, but enough. I held up the folder. There are recorded filings attached to that parcel. Your office apparently hasn't reviewed yet. Vanessa stepped forward immediately. This community will not be intimidated by paperwork games. Applause erupted again. Louder this time. The room wanted confidence, and she kept giving it to them. But while everybody clapped, I noticed something important. Richard Latham wasn't applauding. He was staring at the folder in my hands now. Actually staring. Like a man suddenly realizing there might be a piece missing from the puzzle he'd already promised clients he understood. Vanessa didn't notice. She was too busy winning the room. And that was the moment I realized something else. Vanessa Holloway had built her entire strategy around emotion. Meanwhile, the law was sitting quietly inside county records, waiting to tear it apart. I sat back down. The applause slowly faded. Rainwater rolled down the dark windows beside the community center, while Vanessa launched into another speech about protecting neighborhood traditions. Nobody noticed Richard Latham pull his phone from his pocket and type something quickly beneath the table. But I did. And for the first time since this started, somebody on their side was finally beginning to wonder what exactly had been recorded against Old Bear Lake before the fight ever began. The lien notice arrived 6 days later. Certified mail. Bright orange sticker across the envelope. Legal notice enclosed. I opened it standing beside my truck at the gate, while morning fog drifted low across the lake water. Silver Ridge Estates HOA had officially recorded a lien against Old Bear Lake. Claim amount $4,750. Accumulated fines, administrative penalties, legal review fees, all tied directly to my property. I read the notice twice before folding it carefully and slipping it into the Manila folder with everything else. Then I drove into town to see Grant Callahan. Grant's office sat above an old feed supply store near the county courthouse. No fancy glass walls, no marble reception desk. Just worn hardwood floors, filing cabinets, and a brass nameplate, polished enough to reflect light. He read the lien notice without speaking. Then he smiled. Not because it was funny, because somebody had finally made a mistake big enough to matter. They filed this fast, he said. Vanessa thinks pressure wins. She's probably right most of the time. Grant flipped to the last page. They record this against the parcel? Yesterday. That's aggressive. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Good. I watched him closely. You don't seem concerned. I'm not. Grant opened folder and pulled out the certified county copy sitting beneath the other documents. The filing. The one Vanessa still hadn't pulled. He rested one finger against the stamped recorder seal. They're building this entire case on uninterrupted community use, he said. That only works if access remained uncontested. It didn't, exactly. Outside the office window, a freight truck rattled down Main Street, spraying slush from the tires. Grant looked back at me. You filed before they escalated. 3 days after closing. That timing matters. He slid the document back into the folder carefully. They think this lien pressures you into negotiation. In reality, they just attached legal exposure to a public county record. I already knew where he was going with that. Improper lien filings carried consequences, especially when the filer didn't actually hold legal rights over the property in question. Grant reached for another folder beside his desk. Anything else happen after the meeting? I handed him copies of the old HOA permits Martha and Owen gave me. Dock passes, violation notices, seasonal access schedules. Grant stared at them for a long moment. Well, he muttered softly. That's bad. For them? Oh yeah. He spread the documents across his desk. They weren't just using the lake. They were regulating it, charging for it, enforcing rules on property they didn't own. The heater near the wall clicked loudly. Grant pointed at Vanessa's signature, stamped across one of the violation notices. This creates a whole separate problem. What kind? Financial exposure. That landed heavier than the lien did. Grant continued. If the HOA knowingly collected fees tied to property they had no ownership interest in, every homeowner assessment connected to lake access becomes questionable. I thought about Martha and Owen sitting in my workshop holding old dock permits like expired boarding passes. 20 years of residents paying money towards something built entirely on assumption. Grant leaned forward. Do not respond emotionally to the lien. Do not threaten them. Do not contact Vanessa directly. What do you want me to do? Nothing. I frowned slightly. Nothing. Let them keep escalating. That answer sounded wrong until he explained it. The more formal action they take before reviewing the county filings, the cleaner this becomes later. He tapped the folder once. They're documenting their own exposure for us. By the following weekend, Silver Ridge had turned openly hostile. Residents stopped waving entirely. A pickup slowed beside my property one afternoon, and somebody yelled, "Lake thief," before driving off uphill. Vanessa's flyers appeared across the subdivision bulletin boards again. Protect our community rights. One version included a photograph of the locked gate taken from the trail below, like a crime scene. But underneath all the anger, something else had started moving too. Doubt. I saw it during small moments. Neighbors reading the flyers longer than before. Board members avoiding eye contact at the gas station. Richard Latham's law firm requesting parcel copies from the county clerk's office twice in 3 days. That last part came from Miles Avery. He called me Monday morning. Somebody from the HOA attorney's office finally pulled the parcel history. I tightened my grip slightly on the phone. How much did they request? Everything. Good. Finally. I drove out to the lake afterward carrying new dock posts in the truck bed. Snow clouds hung low across the mountains while the shoreline wind pushed cold spray against the supports beneath the dock. I worked alone most of the afternoon, replacing rusted brackets. Around 4 o'clock, another vehicle rolled down the gravel trail. Not Vanessa. Richard Latham. The attorney stepped out, wearing a wool overcoat and leather gloves. No briefcase this time, just paperwork folded beneath one arm. He stopped near the locked gate and studied the private property sign silently. Then he looked toward me, standing knee-deep beneath the dock frame with a socket wrench in my hand. "You filed earlier than I expected," he called across the water. There it was, first crack in their confidence. I climbed back onto the dock slowly. "You should checked before threatening lawsuits." Latham ignored that. "The HOA still intends to pursue community access rights. Then you should bill them carefully." That almost got a reaction. Almost. Wind rattled the chain against the gate while he looked out over the lake. "Mrs. Holloway believes this community has standing." "No," I corrected calmly. "Mrs. Holloway believes repetition creates ownership." That one landed. Latham adjusted his gloves slowly. "You understand this will get uglier before it settles." I looked toward the shoreline where the old HOA sign still stood bolted beside my lock. "No," I said quietly. "I think it's about to get expensive." He stared at me another second before turning back toward his car. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Vanessa Holloway's side no longer looked certain they were winning. The official lawsuit arrived 4 days later anyway. Silver Ridge Estates HOA versus Ethan Mercer. Filed in County Civil Court just before noon on a Thursday. Prescriptive easement claim. Motion for immediate restoration of community lake access. Request for enforcement of the HOA lien. Vanessa had pushed forward even after Richard Latham pulled the records. That told me 2 things immediately. First, she either didn't understand what the filings meant, or second, worse, she understood perfectly and thought intimidation would still force me to back down before court ever became necessary. Grant Callahan called me less than 20 minutes after the filing posted. "Leave the lake exactly how it is," he said. "Do not remove the sign. Do not touch the gate. And don't contact anybody from the board." "You sound entertained." "I sound like somebody who just watched the other side walk into traffic." That afternoon, I drove into town, carrying the full folder for the first time since buying Old Bear Lake. Grant cleared his conference table before I arrived. Lien notices, HOA permits, meeting minutes, tax records, old photographs of the sign. He arranged everything carefully, beneath the overhead lights while I sat across from him, drinking stale office coffee. Then he placed one document alone at the center of the table. The filing. The document Vanessa should checked before she ever called the deputy. Grant looked at me once. "You ready?" "I was ready 3 weeks ago." He nodded. Then he began drafting the response. Not emotional, not aggressive, surgical. Every sentence tied directly to county record evidence. Every exhibit numbered. Every statement backed by filings, dates, parcel records, or HOA documents. Grant attached the original developer's 2002 permission letter first. The line that mattered sat halfway down the page. Recreational use permitted until revoked by the property owner. Prescriptive easement dies right there, Grant said calmly. Hostile use never existed. Then came the buried 2008 HOA board minutes. Proof the HOA itself questioned ownership years earlier and failed to investigate. Then the dock permits, fee schedules, violation notices, evidence the HOA regulated and profited from property they didn't own. Finally, Grant lifted the last document. County stamped, recorder indexed, permanent. Formal revocation of permissive use and termination of access rights. Recorded 3 days after I closed on Old Bear Lake. 3 weeks before the deputy ever arrived at the dock. Grant slid it carefully into the response packet. "This," he said quietly, "is what kills them." Outside, his office snow drifted lightly across Main Street while headlights moved through downtown traffic below. Inside, Grant finished the final page and signed it. Then he looked up at me. "You understand what this means now?" "Yeah." "No," he corrected. "Legally." He tapped the filing. "The moment this was recorded, Every future claim of uninterrupted community access stopped existing. Permanently. I leaned back slightly. Grant continued. They can argue emotion all day, but county record law doesn't care about emotion. It cares about notice. He held up the stamped page. This gave notice. The response packet went out the next morning simultaneously. Court clerk, HOA attorney, Silver Ridge board members, certified copies to every address involved. By noon, Richard Latham had called Grant 3 times. Grant ignored the first 2, took the third on speaker while I sat across the desk. Latham sounded tired now, not confident, not theatrical. Tired. You filed the revocation before the first dispute occurred, he said flatly. Correct. And the developer letter was permissive from the beginning. Also correct. Silence stretched briefly through the speaker. Then Latham exhaled. My clients were under the impression community use established standing. Grant glanced toward me before answering. Your clients should check the parcel history before recording a lien. Another silence, longer this time. Finally, Latham spoke again. We may need time to review our position. Grant's voice never changed. You already had time. The line disconnected immediately after that. I drove back to Old Bear Lake before sunset. The wind had picked up hard enough to push dark waves against the dock supports, while snow dusted the shoreline grass around the gate. But the important part wasn't the weather. It was the parking lot uphill, beside the Silver Ridge Community Center. Full, board meeting, emergency session. I could practically feel the panic moving through that building from half a mile away. Around 7 that evening, headlights appeared at the lake trail. Vanessa's Range Rover. She stopped beside the gate, but didn't get out immediately. When she finally stepped into the cold, she looked different, still polished, still controlled, but the certainty was gone. She walked up to the chain slowly. I spoke with Richard, she said. I stayed near the dock, hands inside my coat pockets. That makes one of you. Her jaw tightened. You filed that document before any confrontation happened. Yep, that was deliberate. Very. She looked toward the private property sign beneath the old HOA placard. Rain and snow had started peeling one corner loose from the aluminum backing. For the first time since this started, Vanessa Holloway looked at the gate like she wasn't completely sure it belonged to her anymore. Because legally, it didn't. Nothing did. You knew we'd fight this, she said quietly. I knew you'd assume. Her eyes snapped back toward me. You could have handled this differently. I almost laughed at that. You brought deputies to my dock. She looked away first. That mattered. Then she said the one sentence that confirmed the entire thing was collapsing behind the scenes. The board's reconsidering its options. Not winning. Not preparing. Reconsidering. I looked out across Old Bear Lake while cold wind rattled the loose HOA sign against the fence post. Vanessa, I said calmly, you built 20 years of authority on a piece of property nobody on your board ever bothered to verify. She didn't answer, because there wasn't one left to give. Vanessa stood at the gate another few seconds while the wind pushed snow across the gravel trail between us. Then she got back into the Range Rover and drove uphill toward Silver Ridge Estates without another word. That silence traveled faster through the neighborhood than any HOA flyer ever had. By the next morning, people were already talking. Not publicly at first. Quiet conversations beside mailboxes. Board members avoiding residents in the grocery store. Questions replacing certainty. Martha Keene called me around noon. You should see the community Facebook page, she said. I don't use Facebook. You don't need to. People are finally asking for documents. That mattered. Because once homeowners start asking for records, HOAs stop controlling the narrative. The first leaked screenshot hit by evening. A resident asking whether the HOA ever actually owned Old Bear Lake. 3 comments underneath. Then 12. Then 60. By sunrise the next morning, somebody had uploaded copies of the old dock permits Vanessa signed over the years. Another resident posted screenshots of the county tax records showing Old Bear Lake listed under separate private ownership going back decades. The comments turned ugly fast. Not toward me anymore. Toward the board. Toward Vanessa. Toward every annual dues statement carrying the words Lake Maintenance Fund. Grant called just after lunch. "You seeing this? I'm hearing enough." The HOA attorney requested a settlement discussion this morning. I leaned against the truck bed looking uphill toward Silver Ridge. What kind of discussion? The kind where they suddenly stop sounding confident. That afternoon, another vehicle appeared at the lake trail. Not Vanessa this time. A silver sedan. A woman stepped out holding an umbrella against the snow. Late 40s, maybe. Professional posture. Dark coat buttoned high against the cold. She stopped outside the gate. "My name's Clara Whitmore," she said. "I'm on the HOA board." Interesting. I unlocked the chain but left the gate mostly closed. "What can I do for you?" Clara looked uncomfortable being there. Not guilty. Embarrassed. "That lawsuit should never have been filed," she said quietly. First board member to say it out loud. I waited. She glanced back toward the road before continuing. "Vanessa told the board your filings were procedural. She said the attorney believed community use still overrode them. Richard Latham knew better after he pulled the records." Clara nodded once. "I think he tried explaining that." The wind rattled the loose HOA sign above us. "What happened?" I asked. She wouldn't back down. That sounded exactly right. Clara stepped closer to the gate. "2 board members resigned last night." That got my attention. "Over the lawsuit? Over everything." She folded her arms tightly against the cold. "The fees, the permits, the lien." Most of us didn't even realize how much authority Vanessa had concentrated around the lake over the years. I thought about Martha's stack of violation notices sitting inside my workshop. "You approved the fines." "Not individually," Clara admitted. "Most of them were administrative approvals bundled into annual policy renewals. Convenience again. That was always the real poison underneath HOA abuse. Nobody checks anything as long as life feels orderly." Clara looked toward the dock. "How bad is this going to get for the association?" I answered honestly. "That depends how long Vanessa keeps pretending the county records don't exist." Her expression tightened slightly. Then she handed me a sealed envelope. "What's this?" "Internal financial summaries." I opened it enough to glimpse spreadsheets inside. Lake access fees. Yearly totals, maintenance allocations. Grant was going to love this. Clara lowered her voice. She approved legal expenses too without a full board vote. That changed the stakes immediately. HOA bylaws almost always required formal approval thresholds for litigation spending. If Vanessa bypassed those requirements, the board itself could turn against her financially. "Why bring this to me?" I asked. Clara looked back toward Silver Ridge Estates sitting above the lake behind the trees. "Because people trusted us." That answer carried more weight than anything else she said. After she left, I drove directly into town to meet Grant. He spread the financial summaries across his desk slowly while reading line after line. Then he whistled softly. "Well," he muttered, "there's your second disaster." "How bad?" "Depends how angry homeowners get once they realize they paid nearly 20 years of fees for access rights the HOA never legally possessed." He flipped another page. "Jesus." "What?" Grant pointed at one column. "Accumulated lake maintenance collections over 18 years. $148,000. I stared at the number silently, not because it shocked me, because it confirmed exactly how long nobody inside Silver Ridge had questioned anything. Grant leaned back in his chair. "The lawsuit's already dead," he said. "Now they're trying to stop the financial bleeding before residents start demanding audits." Outside his office window, courthouse lights reflected off fresh snow along Main Street. Inside, my phone buzzed twice. Then again. Unknown numbers, messages from residents. We didn't know. She told us the HOA owned it. Is the lawsuit really collapsing? One message stood out more than the others. I'm sorry for what they said at the meeting. No name attached, just that sentence. I set the phone down quietly. Grant looked at me across the desk. You understand what's happening now, right? Yeah, the lake stopped being the real issue days ago. He tapped the financial reports once. Now it's about trust. And somewhere uphill beyond the courthouse windows, Vanessa Holloway was probably realizing the exact same thing. Because the moment homeowners stop fearing the HOA and start questioning it instead, power shifts fast. And Silver Ridge Estates had officially started turning on itself. The withdrawal filing hit County records the following Tuesday at 9:14 in the morning. Grant called before I even saw the update online. They folded, he said simply. No celebration in his voice, just finality. I drove straight into town afterward. The county recorder's office looked exactly the same as every other time I'd walked through those doors during the last month. Fluorescent lights, scuffed tile floors, old ranchers standing in line with deed packets tucked beneath their arms. Normal, that was the strange part. The thing that destroyed Vanessa Holloway's entire case happened quietly between filing cabinets and public record stamps. Not in a courtroom, not at some dramatic hearing, just paperwork. Miles Avery waved me toward the counter when he saw me enter. Thought you'd show up, he said. He slid the certified copies across the desk. Withdrawal of prescriptive easement claim. Release of improper lien. I picked up the first page slowly. Silver Ridge Estates HOA formally abandoning all claims to permanent community access over Old Bear Lake. Just like that, 20 years of assumed ownership erased by the same thing that should have settled the issue from the beginning. County records. Grant arrived a few minutes later carrying coffee in cardboard cups. You read the attorney's statement yet? He asked. Not yet. He handed me the attached letter. Richard Latham's language had changed completely. Following review of the recorded filings and historical ownership documents, the association has elected to discontinue further action regarding parcel access rights. Elected, like they still had a choice. Grant snorted quietly after reading it again. He's trying to keep them from getting sued later. Will it work? Depends how angry homeowners get. That answer came quicker than either of us expected. By afternoon, Silver Ridge was in full collapse mode. Residents demanded emergency meetings. Board members stopped returning calls. Screenshots from the HOA financial summaries spread across neighborhood pages and local community groups faster than Vanessa could contain them. $148,000 collected under lake maintenance assessments tied to property the HOA never owned. People took that personally, because they should have. I drove back toward Old Bear Lake just before sunset. Halfway up the subdivision road, I passed two moving trucks parked outside Vanessa Holloway's house. Not loading furniture yet, just parked there, preparation. The Range Rover sat in the driveway beneath bare pine branches, while two residents stood across the street, pretending not to stare. Nobody waved anymore. Not at her. When I reached the lake trail, another vehicle was already waiting beside the gate. Clara Whitmore stepped out, holding a cordless drill in one hand. 3 other residents stood behind her silently. Martha and Owen were there too. Clara looked tired, not defeated, just exhausted in the get after discovering they defended the wrong thing for too long. The board voted this afternoon, she said. I unlocked the gate. What kind of vote? We accepted Vanessa's resignation. That landed quietly. No anger attached. Just fact. Clara glanced up toward the old HOA sign, bolted above my private property notice. Community Lake Access, Silver Ridge Estates, HO property. The corners had started curling from weather exposure. Would you mind if we removed it ourselves? Clara asked. I looked at the sign for a long moment. That piece of metal caused more damage than most lawsuits ever do. Not because it was official, because people trusted it. Finally, I nodded once. Go ahead. Nobody spoke while Clara climbed the small ladder beside the fence post. The drill whined against the first rusted screw. Then the second. Metal creaked softly as the sign loosened from the wood. A few more residents had gathered quietly near the trail entrance by then. Nobody argued, nobody applauded. They just watched. The same way people watch a funeral procession. Clara lifted the sign free carefully and climbed back down, holding it against her coat. For a second, nobody moved. Then Owen Keene stepped forward. You know, he said quietly, I paid lake fees for 17 years. Nobody answered him. Martha touched his arm gently. The silence after that carried more weight than any shouting ever could. I took the sign from Clara finally. Lighter than it looked, cheap aluminum backing, HOA logo fading near the edges, 20 years of authority built on something that flimsy. I walked it over to the large recycling dumpster beside the maintenance shed near the trailhead. The metal clanged once when I dropped it inside. That sound echoed farther across the lake than I expected. When I turned back around, several residents were staring toward the water instead of at me now. Not hostile anymore, just embarrassed. Grant called while we stood there. I answered on speaker. The audit request passed, he said immediately. How bad? Worse than they hoped. He paused briefly. The new interim board voted unanimously to investigate every lake-related assessment going back 18 years. Clara closed her eyes briefly after hearing that. More silence. Then Grant added one more thing. Vanessa personally authorized legal spending without full board approval. That got a reaction. Martha looked stunned. Owen muttered something under his breath. Clara just shook her head slowly. The wind pushed cold water against the dock pilings behind us, while darkness settled across Old Bear Lake. And standing there beside the useless gate, watching the HOA sign disappear into a recycling bin, I realized the strangest part of the entire fight. Nobody in Silver Ridge Estates actually lost the lake because of me. They lost it because the people running their HOA spent 20 years pretending assumption was the same thing as ownership. Eventually, the law catches up to that kind of mistake. And when it does, it usually happens overnight. The audit report was finished 3 weeks before Christmas. 112 pages. Every lake-related expense, every fee collection, every maintenance allocation tied to Old Bear Lake dating back nearly 2 decades. Grant handed me a copy across his desk without saying much. He didn't need to. The number said, enough. 148,327 tot collected from Silver Ridge residents under lake access and maintenance assessments. The HOA legally owned none of it. Some expenses were legitimate: dock repairs, trail clearing, insurance riders, trash removal. But thousands of dollars had still been collected under the assumption that the HOA controlled property it never possessed. And now every homeowner in Silver Ridge knew it. The new interim board held the public meeting 4 nights later. Not Vanessa, Clara Whitmore. The community center looked different without the banners and emotional speeches. No projector slides, no fireworks photographs, no microphone theatrics, just tables, documents, residents demanding answers. I stood near the back beside Owen Keene while Clara walked through the audit findings 1 page at a time. Nobody interrupted her, because anger sounds different once people realize they've been misled. Quieter, sharper. One homeowner stood up halfway through the meeting, holding an old dues statement in his hand. I paid these fees for 15 years, he said. Did anyone on this board ever verify ownership? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Clara spoke honestly. No, that word hit harder than any courtroom ruling ever could. Another resident asked about the lawsuit, another about the lien. Then somebody finally asked the question everyone had been circling around for weeks. What happens to Vanessa Holloway? The room went still. Clara adjusted the papers in front of her before answering carefully. The previous board president authorized legal expenditures without formal approval under HOA bylaws. Murmurs spread instantly, she continued. Insurance counsel advised the association not to assume personal liability costs connected to unauthorized litigation decisions. Translation: Vanessa was on her own. I never saw her at another HOA meeting after that. By January, the Range Rover was gone. A for sale sign appeared in front of her house 3 days later. No dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation, just disappearance. That felt appropriate somehow, because people like Vanessa rarely collapse loudly. Usually they just run out of rooms willing to listen anymore. The lake itself changed too after the fight ended, not physically. Emotionally, the tension disappeared first. Then the rumors, then the gawking trucks slowing near the gate. Winter settled quietly across Old Bear Lake while I finished rebuilding the south dock supports one board at a time. Most mornings started the same way. Coffee steaming beside the truck, cold air rolling across the water, tools laid out carefully across the dock planks, simple, peaceful, exactly what I wanted when I bought the place. One morning near the end of January, headlights rolled slowly down the gravel trail again. Owen and Martha. Owen climbed out, carrying a toolbox. "Figured your railing probably needs finishing," he said casually. Martha held another pie dish. Blueberry this time. I laughed before I could stop myself. The three of us worked on the dock together most of the afternoon. No HOA talk, no lawsuits. Just measurements, lumber bolts, and lake water knocking softly beneath the pilings. That mattered more than people realize, because the fight was never really about revenge. It was about truth, about boundaries, about the difference between assumption and ownership. Around sunset, Martha finally asked the question I knew somebody would eventually ask. "What happens now?" I set down the impact driver and looked across the lake. The gate stood uphill near the trail entrance. No HOA sign anymore, just the chain, the lock, and the private property notice beneath it. "I keep the lake," I said. Martha nodded slowly. "That's fair." Owen wiped his hands on a shop rag. "But," I smiled slightly, "but permission works differently when people respect it." Neither of them spoke for a second. Then Martha looked toward the shoreline. Some of the residents were wondering. She started carefully, whether maybe someday you'd allow fishing again, or kayaking, small things. I thought about that quietly, about the deputy telling me to step away from my own dock, about Vanessa pointing at me like I was trespassing, about the flyers, the fines, the lien. Then I thought about Martha carrying pies to a man the neighborhood treated like an enemy for weeks, about Owen showing up with tools instead of demands, about Clara standing in front of angry residents and finally telling the truth. Communities aren't buildings. They're choices, and Silver Ridge finally started making better ones. The next morning I walked up to the gate alone, just after sunrise. The snow had frozen hard overnight beneath my boots. The lake reflected pale winter light through the pine trees while steam curled from the coffee in my hand. I unlocked the chain slowly, then I opened the gate halfway. Not wide, not symbolic, just enough. A new sign hung beneath the private property notice now. Lake access by owner permission. Only please respect the property. Simple. Honest. True. I stood there a while listening to the water move against the rebuilt dock down below. No sirens, no HOA meetings, no lawyers, just quiet. And standing there beside the gate that had once started a war, I realized the strongest thing on that lake had never been the chain, or the signs, or even the lawsuit. It was one county-stamped page filed quietly before anybody thought to check the truth.
I think that's a real lesson here. A lot of trouble in life starts when people stop checking what's real and start relying on assumption, habits, or whoever talked the loudest in the room. The folk in Silver Ridge wasn't bad people. Most of them trusted what they were taught because the shy had been there for years and nobody had a reason to question it. But the truth was still sitting in the public records the whole time. waiting for somebody willing to slow down, read carefully, and stand their ground without losing themselves in anger. And honestly, that's matter more now than ever. You don't have to shout the loudest to protect what's yours. Sometimes patience, paperwork, and keeping your dignity carry more weight than anything else. If you ever deal with an HOA, a property dispute, or even just a situation where people assume they are right without checking the facts, drop the truth matter down in the comments. I'm really glad to hear your story. And if you enjoy the quiet land rides and HOA trusted stories, subscribe and stick around. There are plenty more plots, ranches, glass, and hard-earned classics ahead.